Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, as always before we begin, please remember that I have begun a Patreon to help this channel as well as the art that I do outside of this channel. There is a link tree in the description below. The first link should be to my Patreon, and it is right now $1 a month. That's it, $1 every month so that I can afford food, rent, electricity, or as I'm saying this in August of East Texas, air conditioning. And then also comics and art supplies, because they ain't cheap either. So anything and everything you can do to help, I would be immensely appreciative. So today's going to be pretty interesting because we are going to begin tackling a series that until recently I was relatively ignorant of. And again, as I've noted before, I'm friends with the owner of my hometown comic book shop, Ground Zero Comics, and one of my best friends is the co-owner, Michael Siegler. And he is always lobbying me to pick up a book titled Grendel. Now, some people will immediately go, ooh, Grendel? We're finally doing that one? The rest of you are probably going to be like me when I first started going like, wait, isn't that the bad guy in Beowulf? Fun fact, yes, it is the bad guy in Beowulf, but it's actually not the topic of this comic. I do have the graphic novelization of Beowulf, and I really need to sit down and read that one again so I can do it for the channel. But today's video will, in fact, actually be about Grendel by Matt Wagner. Now, this is a pretty epic series. Epic in the fact that there are literally hundreds of issues, and the story, I can't even really begin to provide a basic TLDR version of what Grendel is actually about, because it's been going on for years, and it begins predominantly with an intellectual sociopath who dresses up like a demon and basically kills for the mob and for his own pleasure, and then eventually becomes a sentient cyborg hundreds of years in the future. And there's werewolves. And an evil church. It's wild. And I have only barely scratched the surface of this series. So, please, longtime Grendel fans recognize that I'm just hopping into this series. And so, there's going to be things I completely mess up and screw up. But that's part of the fun, is learning as we go. So, as you can see, today's video is going to be from Grendel. Now, it's important to recognize this is the Grendel Omnibus that was put out by Dark Horse ages ago. This one is, unfortunately, currently out of print. But I have no intention of trying to tackle this entire omnibus in one video. That's just absurd. There's far too much to discuss and talk about. Fortunately, the nice thing about these omnibuses is that they are kind of effectively bound trades. But at the same time, this omnibus is almost like a bound trade of several trades, because today we're actually not going to be talking about a full trade. We're going to be talking about this very first story here, Devil by the Deed. It's about 43 pages long, so you can kind of think of it more like, well, a single issue comic, because it's pretty much just about 43 pages, and it, in this first issue, basically describes the entire initial arc of Grendel, particularly the Grendel known as Hunter Rose. It lays out his story, his biography, a couple interesting facts of his life, and then the main reason why I'm talking about it today, of course, is because formally it is stunning and an amazing opportunity to reflect on how the structure of comics can do so much for delivering just wonderful narrative impact upon the reader. But I've done a lot of introductions. Let's get into Grendel, and let's talk about, well, why I think it's cool. Alright, so now I've done kind of a very basic introduction to what today's video is. Again, Part 1, or really the first story in this Grendel omnibus, Grendel Devil by Deed. Now, it's important to recognize this first issue acts narratively as a kind of overarching arc of the Hunter Rose saga. And I mention this name because it's important. When we talk about the character of Grendel, we have to understand that this outer form, Grendel, is a name that's just going to change as the series progresses. Effectively, you can think of it kind of the way sometimes you get in superhero comics, where it begins with one particular character and then another character assumes the costume over time. But what's different about the Grendel narrative is that, unlike a superhero storyline where it's multiple people rising up to embody this idea that is ultimately founded in virtue, Grendel is a tad different, because Grendel begins as more or less the intellectual exercise of a bored sociopath, and then as the series progresses would become more and more kind of corrupted and twisted and altered by each person who would eventually assume the mantle for themselves. And so, as my friend Michael sort of illuminated to me when I asked him, what do you think this series is really about? He said, it's basically about what happens when an idea is taken and changed over time, which I think is kind of cool. But it begins first and foremost with this character here. His name is Hunter Rose, and Devil by Deed is effectively his story. Now, it's also important to recognize that narratively, this is very different than a kind of traditional comic book where we get characters acting through a sequence and we're aware that these characters are moving through time and we're learning at the same time as them. This first comic is a kind of obituary, I might argue, or really just a general summary of the Hunter Rose arc that will then be explored through the remainder of this actual omnibus. And it's framed on the very last page as the reporting of this woman here, what was her name again? Christine Powell, a reporter who I believe plays a role in the later part of the series, but you'll note from my bookmark, I'm still technically reading this book, so that may be something we'll learn later on. But what's important to note is that as you're reading this first issue, we're basically coming at it after everything has happened. And on the one hand, this is a way for Matt Wagner to basically create the Grendel myth, but it's also for him to create a kind of narrative skeleton for him to then move forward in the later issues and stories to kind of flesh out and go, okay, here's what I think Grendel is. Now let's tell some stories around this basic arc. So narratively, this book kind of throws a lot at the reader at once. And I'll be honest, the first time I read it, I missed so much. But again, today's video is more about, as always, the form that this comic is taking and what Matt Wagner is doing with the form. And I say this a lot, but Wagner is a marvel to me because I was not expecting the level of construction that was going into these panels. You'll note throughout these initial pages, or actually throughout this comic book, we don't really get much in the way of word balloons. You'll see these long or these large white blocks of text that are kind of scattered throughout these pages. That's because, again, we're effectively reading a news report or the sample out of a biography. We're reading about Hunter Rose, the story, his life, how he effectively rose from being a kind of bored 17-year-old to meeting the love of his life, losing her a few years later, and then at the age of 17, adopting the mantle of Grendel, who would effectively become a hitman for the mafia, but then ultimately a kind of crime lord himself that sort of borders on an idea rather than a physical person. And also, you know, his ongoing bromance / antagonism with a werewolf. It's a fun read. It's really good. It's really, really good. But again, I bring this up so that we can understand that whatever is taking place here within these text blocks is then going to inform what is taking place within the panels themselves. And hopefully you can kind of just observe from looking at these pages the level of artistry that is going into Devil by Deed. If we look at just, say, this one particular page right here, where we observe Hunter Rose's sort of introduction into the social lifestyle, or introduced to high society, his sort of success, and then his slow machinations in terms of overtaking and controlling the organized mob, or excuse me, the organized crime syndicates within the city that he lives in, which, full disclosure, I honestly don't remember what city it is. In fact, I don't think it's even supposed to be a city. I think they just throw him in an urban landscape and go, hey, just go. It's not important. What is important is if we look at the way that Wagner is creating and structuring these pages, because again, you'll see here we have these 4 panels followed by this panel right down here. But it's not just that we have 4 panels that sort of slowly progress Hunter Rose's transition over into the Grendel character here, setting up these long, vertical panels like this, it creates a sense of dramatic tension. These characters are sort of tightened into place, and we kind of observe Hunter Rose's proximity next to this character before eventually Grendel taking over and overpowering the character. And then along with that, you'll note throughout this page these little squares that are kind of like interlocking over one another. It doesn't necessarily do anything to the story, but it creates a really interesting graphic design that the reader is able to latch onto. And in fact, one of the real joys of the first issue of Grendel is just taking a time to stop and look at the way that he's playing with these panel layouts. Again, you have this beautiful long arc in which we observe Hunter Rose's adopted daughter Stacy just kind of sitting bored in what appears to be a fountain, and then down below, Hunter just kind of observing. And again, you'll see that we have these smaller panels in connection with this larger panel to create a narrative effect. We're seeing all of this space and Stacy kind of off-center in the middle of it to heighten her isolation. She's the adopted daughter of Hunter Rose, but she's bored, and she is yet another sort of intellectual exercise for Hunter to try to control and then fundamentally fail at. Now, if I progress a little further forward, another really stunning page, we see a sequence in which, we see a sequence, or we read about the sequence in which Grendel effectively has numerous mob bosses assassinated. It reads, "Within 2 weeks occurred the infamous flamboyant precision slaying of 23 East Coast crime bosses, which soon came to be collectively known as the Seaboard Massacre. Within an hour of the last of these killings, police everywhere received word via untraceable lines from Grendel himself, who claimed credit, tribute, and command. He was, quite publicly, voicing his self-proclaimed position as lord over the criminal East Coast." Now, we've got a solid story bite, we've got facts and details and information, and then it kind of sets up what would take place in some of these later editions of the way that Grendel would exercise control over organized crime. Now, look at the page, and I would really encourage you, take a moment, pause your screen real quick, and just really stop to sample this in, because this is beautiful. Like, I was just stopping every other page to just stare at this comic because I had never seen anything like this before. You'll look right here on the very center is Grendel himself. Now, this is a sort of common motif throughout the Grendel comic. Wagner will sort of use the face of Grendel as a kind of iconography to sort of latch onto the reader's mind and go, I know what we're talking about. This is Grendel. It's sort of the way a lot of comic artists would use like basic color patterns for superhero comics in order to establish a kind of recognition with the symbol and, commercially speaking, connected with a particular brand. And once people have that in their minds, it becomes more than just a character they're reading. It becomes a symbol of something larger than themselves, which again is everything that Grendel is really about. But this page is really beautiful in the fact that you have an incredible combination of words and imagery using panels to connect everything together. So again, if you'll note, we have Grendel here at the very center, and then we have individual shots of all the crime bosses dying in their own individual ways. Now note, most of the time here, you're just seeing dead bodies. But that's really all that we need to see, because again, everything is moving back to this central point in the center of the circle. My AC is turning on. I gotta pause it just for a sec, but we'll continue in just a second. Alright, my AC is off. Hopefully this time it'll stay off. Again, it's August in Texas, y'all, and I have my AC turned off so it doesn't disturb you. I really hope you appreciate the lengths that I'm willing to go to talk about comics for you. Patreon in the link description below. Anyway, as I was saying, you have, again, Grendel at the center of all of these deaths, and if I can bump a little, or hop a little bit into my high school geometry here, you have this beautiful angling effect in which all of these vectors continually point back to Grendel himself. And it's important to note, too, that the shape is a circle. If you consider mathematically and philosophically the circle itself, it was always considered one of the most holy and philosophically significant polygons, because mathematically speaking, a circle has no true beginning or end. This is one of the reasons why when the early Christian church adopted a lot of Platonic ideals, they would often use the circle, because again, the circle has no true beginning or end. Kind of like, God, if you believe in that sort of thing. So if we look at this moment, Grendel has effectively eliminated all of his competition and made himself the sole focus of every criminal enterprise, and demonstrated his power, which then moves down in this beautiful triangular pattern down to the police. And so we see here almost a kind of iconography of Grendel effectively killing off all the other bosses and demonstrating his authority to the police, who are presented here as beneath Grendel. And again, the text reminds us that Grendel is effectively doing just that. He's letting them know, hey, I have power over you, and this is the way things are going to go. One page, and all of that is communicated in just a small handful of panels, and then using a particular number of shapes and arrangement of the figures within the larger panel, we create a kind of embedded rhetoric, while we're also telling a story of one of the biggest mob hits, like, in criminal history. I mean, it's a fictional story, so take that into account. But again, hopefully you can see how much play Wagner is doing with these panels. And I can show you, again, example after example of continual instances of the way that Wagner is using the story, or using the material within the text, and then using the format and the panel arrangements to create a sort of subtextual narrative for the reader, all at the same time making some stunningly complex pages. I mean, there's more done in one issue of this particular comic book than there have sometimes in an entire history of a person's career. But one last page I really want to focus on, and it's the big final confrontation between Argent the werewolf and Hunter Rose, aka Grendel. Now, I recognize dropping the werewolf here a couple of times. What's the story behind the werewolf? We don't know. Like, that's it. Like, again, take into account, I'm pretty far through this, and I still haven't really found an answer to it. And in fact, there may not necessarily be an answer, The sky is blue, grass is green, there's a werewolf. Just run with it. What's important here is that Argent the werewolf is intelligent, he's cunning, and he's constantly putting himself forward as the foe to Grendel. And Grendel himself sort of plays along with this, because again, he's a highly intelligent sociopath who's really bored. That's kind of what the whole criminal enterprise is. But finally, Wagner describes the final confrontation between Argent and Grendel and gives us this magnificent 2-page spread. And I would really encourage you, again, pause for a moment, just pause your screen and look at this layout. Have you paused? Okay. If you really look at it, we have, maybe at the most, one little text box down here. But what's important is you have these two figures standing kind of opposed to one another, but also pay attention to the shapes. Again, we have a semicircle. A semicircle is very reminiscent of a kind of theater performance square. It's kind of like an amphitheater where we have these two figures who have been through this text kind of lifted up into almost godlike status, confronting one another in a final fight, which will ultimately resolve in, spoiler alert, the death of Grendel and the lifelong crippling of Argent. This is a huge fight. And again, this is really late in the book. Like, you've got maybe 3 or 4 more pages before the end of Devil by Deed. And so everything in the book has kind of been leading up to this point so that we can recognize that this is going to be the end of Grendel. But the shape does a little more than just kind of summon the imagery of an amphitheater and the notion of these gods performing on stage. We also have a really interesting effect of the larger panel of the fight itself. I know, I'm sorry, I really need to figure out a way to prop these things up. But we also have here these little singular circles that, if you take a moment each time, slowly reveals the details of the fight. We're able to observe how each of these characters is reacting to the other. And color code sort of creates an imbalance in which we have alternating red and white, but then again, at the same time, it creates a sense of balance. These two are balanced figures fighting and confronting one another. But again, you have smaller panels within the larger panels to sort of create the emotional and just sheer powerful resonance of this confrontation. I've talked about 3 panels from Devil by Deed, and y'all, I haven't even scratched the surface, but like, y'all have lives, and you've only got so much time to listen to me geek out in front of a camera. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and just end it with those 3 example panels and just do the last hurrah and call it a day, because what more can I say? So, Devil by Deed from the Grendel Omnibus #1 by Matt Wagner. It's incredible. Like, I say this a lot, but that's because I tend to try to focus on books that I really love and enjoy. But it's true. I wasn't really ready for Grendel. It was amazing and incredible in ways that I didn't even think were possible through the medium of comics. And that's coming from me, y'all. I read practically nothing but comics. If you look at the issue of Devil by Deed, it's an impressive demonstration of how panel layouts, when matched carefully with narrative content, can create stunning visuals, the likes of which can almost leave you breathless. This first issue of Grendel does more than just lay out the myth of Grendel, the overall arc of the narrative of Grendel. It's an impressive story in and of itself, because again, formally, Wagner is using so many subtle tricks to just set the skeleton of this arc down to go, hey, this is the overall story, and it's amazing, and it's incredible, but just wait, there's more to come. And so I'd really encourage you that if you are interested in comics, if you just need a wonderful story to read, or, Lord, if you haven't been impressed by Wagner's composition skills at this moment, pick up a copy of Devil by Deed, pick up a copy of this Grendel Omnibus, or pick up any of the bound trades of Grendel. Trust me, you won't be sorry. All right, I'm going to call it a day there. Thank you so much for watching. I tremendously appreciate it. I'm actually burning up right now because it's really, really, really freaking hot inside of my house, so I'm going to make this last part really quickly. Thank you so much for watching again. I tremendously appreciate it. Like, share, and subscribe, all that claptrap. It lets me know that you like the show, that you want to see more. Again, if you also respect this show as a kind of educational tool, or if you just like laughing at me for half an hour, or even if you just, hey, find the show mildly engaging, please, 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 $1 in Patreon, that's all I'm asking for. If you got $12 this year that you don't mind parting with, or even just $1 this month that you don't mind parting with, throw a couple pennies in my hat, because everything you do will help me continue this show going. Now, when it comes to Grendel, tracking down copies is kind of hard. And the reason for this is simple. It's Dark Horse. And Dark Horse has had a lot of rough times lately, especially since Disney purchased Lucasfilms as well as 21st Century Fox. They've lost Predator, Alien, and Star Wars, 3 of their biggest comics lineups. And so series like Grendel's, while being very niche and fan favorites, aren't always going to make them a lot of money. This is all just my way of saying these books aren't going to get a reprint anytime soon. So finding an issue of Devil by Deed is going to be really hard. What I would recommend doing, first and foremost, go to your local comic book shop. 1, because comic shops need your money a lot more than Amazon does. Or eBay. Trust me. Go to your local comic book shop. They're good people. They'll probably have some single-issue bins in which you can just sort of dig through and find some Grendel comics. And even if you can't find a copy of Devil by Deed, the rest of the series is definitely worth your time. But look at your local comic book shop, and then also see if they've got any bound trades in their general collection. Also, of course, don't forget, you live in a world with public libraries. Go to your local public library, see if they've got a graphic novel section, and if they do, see if they've got Grendel. If they don't, just ask for an interlibrary loan form, and I promise you they should be able to get you a copy of the book. And with that, I say again, thank y'all so much for tuning in. I tremendously appreciate it. Go read some comics.